May 2nd, 1945, the charred remains of the bodies of Adolf Hitler and his wife Eva Braun lie abandoned in a shallow grave in the garden of the Reich's chancellery. The hated Nazi regime is at last vanquished. But for the surviving victims of Nazism, the search for their stolen belongings and property had only just begun.
It was certainly one of the largest mass robberies in history. It was organized by the Nazi state, and they really tried to get everything they could, especially from the Jews.
So there you have Jewish property, Jewish money, all taken away. And there are still people who are actually fighting to get works of art that they own back into their own ownership, and properties back into their own ownership.
It wasn't only stolen belongings and property that was missing. Many of the Nazi war criminals also seemed to slip through the net.
There was an underground movement that was set up in order to help high-profile Nazis escape.
Many of them went on to have normal lives after the war. The sentences were, in general, too lenient, and the pardons came too quickly.
Many of those who helped finance Hitler or used slave labor during the war would receive a mere slap on the wrist, while millions of their victims are still seeking justice and reparation even today.
If you really want to know where Nazi gold is, just get on a plane to Zurich and it's under the streets.
Europe, 1945. The mighty Reich of 1,000 years shrinks under the steady advance of the Allies on both fronts. Behind enemy lines, Allied bombings and acts of sabotage demoralize Germany's last remaining troops and civilians. Adolf Hitler's demented obsession with conquest and domination has driven the whole nation into a nightmare.
There's an amazing sort of film of an airplane going over Berlin just right at the end of the war, and you see the desolation below. It's like something from Dante's Inferno. So really, you know, Germany fought this war to rule the world, you know, but ended up at the end of the world. And what a terrible, you know, subterranean world it was.
People are homeless, people are refugees. They're refugees going everywhere. There are also troops retreating. It's a very, very complicated, very messy, very violent situation. It's a time in which people can hide things if they want to.
But long before the final, desperate struggle for Berlin, the Nazis have been taking steps to hide the wealth they had stolen from their millions of victims. On April 6, 1945, U.S. military policemen stopped two women breaking curfew in the vicinity of the town of Merkers, a mining region a couple of hours northeast of Frankfurt in central Germany. As both women are French and can't communicate, the Americans decide to take them to their command post to find a French-speaking colleague. At the command post, they discover that one of the women is pregnant and urgently needs to see a doctor. They decide to take them into town. On their way into Merkers, as they pass by the Kaiserroda salt mine, one of the women makes a surprising revelation to the American servicemen.
And then one of these women starts saying, in that mine over there, there's this incredibly big amount of treasure. And so these three American soldiers, they obviously report this to their superiors. They go into the mine, and it's like Aladdin's cave.
Inside the mine, the U.S. military would find over 8,000 gold bars, along with thousands of bags, boxes, and crates containing currency, gold coins, and other objects in the same metal, as well as silver, platinum, and priceless works of art.
Here, GIs uncovered a fabulous hoard of jewelry, silver, currency, bullion, and art treasures. Much of it the accumulated loot of 5 years of war.
In the following months, similar finds would be made all over Germany and its occupied territories, especially looted art. Yet many assets would be hard to find as a result of senior Nazis spiriting away stolen wealth and treasure to so-called neutral countries towards the end of the war.
There are other countries that the Nazis liked sending their money to because they thought that might end up being quite a good place to go and hide. So Argentina was an obvious place. And another place that's often overlooked is Spain. A lot of money went to Spain and went into these big holding companies that essentially were money laundering for the Nazis.
South America proved particularly welcoming and hospitable to escaping Nazi war criminals.
In many instances, there were large German communities that had been there since the 19th century, so it was a good place for them to blend in. Eichmann managed to escape to Argentina. Joseph Mengele managed to escape through South America, ending up in Brazil. Klaus Barbie, for instance, ends up in Bolivia. And it wasn't just South America, it was, in many cases, the United States.
You've got to remember that Juan Perón and his wife, they were fascists. They liked Nazis. And I think that Argentina only declared war on Nazi Germany about 1 month before the war ended, just to make it look as though they were on the right side. So that was a very cynical move. Some of them, there were a lot of other sort of dictators around still. Just because Hitler died doesn't mean that fascism died. You have Salazar in Portugal, you have Franco in Spain, you have very dictatorial regimes in the Middle East. So there's a lot of places around the world where a Nazi is going to feel at home if he no longer is able to stay in Germany or Austria.
The fleeing Nazis would take several different and secret escape routes, which became known as the Ratlines, invariably taking with them as much of their stolen loot as they could carry.
Some of them would escape through Denmark, some of them would escape through Spain, but I think the one people know a lot about, the one that's covered a lot, is the kind of route that went through Germany, through Austria, over the Alps, over the Brenner Pass, and then into the Alto Adige, into Italy, and towns like Bolzano and Merano. And then from there, some of the escapers would get false papers from priests, and then they would make their way either to Rome, where they would get more false papers, or they would go to Genoa. And then from Genoa, they get on a boat with a Red Cross passport under a false name.
At the end of the war, the International Committee of the Red Cross issued hundreds of thousands of safe conduct permits for the survivors from concentration camps, former POWs, deportees, forced laborers, and other civilians who didn't have valid travel documents. We now know that in many cases, Nazi criminals stole and forged these documents to make their escape. It has even been alleged that corrupt elements in the Vatican conspired to redirect these Red Cross permits to escaping Nazis.
A lot of Nazis were able to sort of slip through the cracks and become other people. Many of the Jews I interviewed who ended up going to Buenos Aires said that they recognized people from the Nazi camps on the boat who were also refugees going to the same place.
We can't say that the Vatican helped as an organization. There was no policy by the Pope to help Nazis escape, but there were members of the Vatican and priests and even a bishop called Luigi Hudal who did actively help Nazis escape by issuing them with documentation. In the archives of the Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome, which is where Bishop Hudal lived and worked, you have papers written to him by former Nazis saying, please, can you help?
It has been said that many of these escaped Nazis lived the rest of their lives protected and financed by a secret organization known as the Organization of the Former SS Members, or Odessa, and that Odessa was funded by much of the looted wealth the Nazis had hidden and transferred abroad.
I spoke to a Nazi, a man called Erich Priebke, who ended up being incarcerated in Rome until he died quite recently. And I spoke to him about his escape to Argentina, and he said to me, listen, there was no Odessa. I rather wish there was one, because then I would have had some money. You know, some of these Nazis arrived in Argentina, they were quite poor. Some of the Nazis were very rich. So that, of course, tells you that some of them had the treasure, and some of them just had nothing.
Yet not all Nazis would manage to escape. Many would soon face justice at Nuremberg, including some of those who were involved in the financing of Hitler's criminal empire. But were all the right men on trial? And how would the Allies even begin to prosecute such heinous crimes or compensate its victims? In May of 1945, the Allies mistakenly freed some Nazi political prisoners, among them 2 notorious names in the Hitler money trail, Industrialist Fritz Thyssen and Hjalmar Schacht, the former head of the Reichsbank and the financial brain behind Germany's military rearmament. But it wouldn't be long before both were rearrested and indicted for war crimes. Nuremberg, November the 20th, 1945. The eyes of the world are on one of the most publicized and awaited trials in the history of mankind. 22 of the most prominent Nazi leaders would be judged for crimes against humanity. Hjalmar Schacht would sit among the accused for his role both as president of the Reichsbank from 1933 till January 1939, as well as Nazi Minister of Economic Affairs from 1934 till 1937.
We realized at last that the Allies had some political objective in view, which made them anxious to brand us as criminals of the Hitler regime. The trial of war criminals had already been planned, and it was obviously essential for the purposes of that trial that prominent economists and businessmen should be numbered among the accused.
Ja, Schacht wurde verdächtigt, einen Angriffskrieg vorbereitet zu haben, und es gab ja auch gute Gründe dafür, dieses so anzunehmen. Nämlich Schacht hatte im Prinzip die finanziellen Voraussetzungen für die Aufrüstung geschaffen und hatte im Prinzip den deutschen Außenhandel zugunsten der Aufrüstung reorganisiert. Jedoch eine Vorbereitung eines Angriffskrieges im unmittelbaren Sinne konnte ihm nicht nachgewiesen werden, weil Schacht sein Amt im Januar 1939, also schon vor Beginn des Krieges, verlor und er für alle weiteren Entscheidungen der politischen Führung des Regimes nicht mehr verantwortlich war.
Schacht would end up being acquitted, and instead it would be his successor as president of the Reichsbank, Walter Funk, who would be sentenced to life imprisonment for his role in financing and facilitating Hitler's war plans. During the trial, Hjalmar Schacht would have the chance to meet again with the man who had first brought him into the Nazis' highest circle, Hermann Göring. By 1936, the men, once friends, had become fierce rivals after Hitler nominated Göring as the supervisor of the second four-year economic plan. It was a rivalry that would end with Schacht's resignation as Minister of Economic Affairs and his dismissal as president of the Reichsbank. By the end of the war, however, Göring, like Schacht, had fallen out of favor with the Führer and had been abandoned to his drug addictions and other excesses. In the Nuremberg jail, Göring was weaned off the drugs and reveled in his role as the most senior Nazi leader in the dock.
Personally, I have always looked upon Göring as the worst among the accused, on account of his decent origin and comfortable circumstances. But at the Nuremberg trial, Göring displayed great courage, both in his behavior and his half-audible exclamations.
Göring's prominent role in the rearmament of the Reich and his direct responsibility for the extortion of Jewish-owned factories and businesses where thousands of inmates were worked to death ended with him being sentenced to hang. But even he would escape proper justice since he took the coward's way out and committed suicide with a cyanide capsule on the eve of his execution. It was the final failure of Nuremberg.
My point of view on the Nuremberg trials is that they tried to narrow it down as much as they could. I mean, in the end, they sort of picked up, there were 22 major Nazis. Well, there were more than 22 major Nazis. I mean, there were 42 Gauleiters, for example, and these Gauleiters were heavily involved in, filling up the concentration camps, implementing the transfer of people from Germany to the death camps. Surely they should have been put on trial. No, they got off scot-free.
As would several of Hitler's financiers, including Gustav Krupp von Bohlen, the main arms manufacturer and the mastermind of the Adolf Hitler Fund that other industrialists would use to make generous contributions to the Nazi Party and the Fuhrer himself.
The Krupps really were behind Hitler, behind the rearmament, involved, implicated in the Holocaust and all kinds of things like that. So it wasn't really old Gustav Krupp, but a lot of people thought so, and at the end of the war, the Americans thought so, and they were looking for him and trying to arrest him, and all they got was this poor old senile fella in bed.
Deemed unfit to attend trial, the case against Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach would be dismissed. Instead, his son Alfred, who had conspired with the SS to enslave conscripted workers to operate the Krupps' wartime factories, would be charged in his place. From the 9th of December 1946 until the 13th of April 1949, the Allies would carry out 12 subsequent trials at Nuremberg, where they would attempt to prosecute German industrialists for their support of the Nazis. But these too were deeply flawed.
Es wurden tatsächlich auch große Prozesse in Nürnberg gegen deutsche Industrielle durchgeführt, beispielsweise ein IG Farben-Prozess gegen den Vorstand der IG Farben, einen Krupp-Prozess gegen Gustav Krupp und seinen Sohn und noch einen weiteren Prozess, in dem ein Vorstand der Dresdner Bank, Karl Rasche hieß er, auch vor Gericht gestellt wurde. So gesehen war es also schon, gerade im Interesse der Amerikaner, die deutsche Wirtschaftselite auch von ehemaligen aktiven Nationalsozialisten zu säubern und vor allen Dingen die, kann man sagen, potenziell politisch gefährlichen Machtzentren der deutschen Industrie, die großen Trusts und Konzerne zu zerschlagen.
Among the most noteworthy of these trials was that of Oswald Pohl, the head of the SS Main Economic and Administrative Office, which coordinated the running of the concentration camps, the supply of slave labor, and the looting of victims' properties and businesses. The court sentenced Pohl and 3 of his subordinates to death, while another 11 would receive sentences between 10 years and life. But in the end, only Pohl would be executed. The others would see their sentences commuted or even in some cases canceled altogether. Unlike the unfortunate Pohl, who was hanged on June 7, 1951.
He was one of the last people hanged as a result of the Nuremberg trials. Oddly enough, after that, the Allies went over to a policy more of pardon and toleration. So not many of the SS officers really punished after the war.
The first industrialist to receive an exclusive trial was the coal and steel magnate Friedrich Flick. On April the 19th, 1947, he was indicted on war crimes and crimes against humanity for the widespread use of slave labor in his mines and factories, along with the theft of resources and plants in occupied territories. And last but not least, the financing of the NSDAP and the SS. He would be sentenced to just 7 years in prison. The second major industrial trial, held from the 27th of August 1947 until July 30th, 1948, would be against IG Farben, the major chemical cartel that was the Nazis' partner in crime, supplying the German war machine with synthetic gasoline and rubber and the infamous pesticide Zyklon B that would be used to slaughter millions of Jews.
IG Farben war der größte deutsche Konzern und war auch der Konzern, der also die größte Zahl von Zwangsarbeitskräften einsetzte. von zivilen Zwangsarbeitern wie von KZ-Häftlingen ist ja bekannt, dass die IG Farben neben dem KZ Auschwitz ein großes Werk bauten, das ausschließlich mit Hilfe von Zwangsarbeitern gebaut wurde, das IG Farbenberg Auschwitz-Monowitz. So gesehen war IG Farben der Inbegriff für die Ausbeutung von Zwangsarbeitern. Und dafür wurden die Vorstandsmitglieder auch verurteilt.
Of the 24 accused IG Farben executives, 11 would be acquitted, while the others would receive sentences ranging from 8 years to only 18 months. This for developing and supplying products and chemicals used to slaughter millions.
The verdicts of industrialists, like the verdicts of the SS officers in general who ran the camps and these industries, were too lenient. I think that there were very few people in industry round up.
The Industrialist trial was a complete farce in the sense that they let off all of the directors of these big companies on the basis that they were taking orders, and before you knew it, all the major companies of the Nazi period become the major companies in Germany in the post-war period.
The Nuremberg trials would not be the only occasion on which Nazis would face prosecution for their crimes. All over the country and in the former occupied territories, civilian courts would try several former Nazis and collaborators in a process that became known as Denazification. Like Nuremberg, however, Denazification did little more than scratch the surface of the deep-seated Nazi infrastructure.
Die Alliierten waren sich darüber einig, das deutsche Volk zu entnazifizieren und alle ehemaligen Nationalsozialisten nicht nur aus der Führung des Staates, der öffentlichen Verwaltung und der Justiz, sondern auch aus der Führung der Wirtschaft zu entfernen. Die Amerikaner also hatten schon Listen angelegt mit deutschen Unternehmern und Vorstandsmitgliedern, die sie auf jeden Fall verhören und dann, also falls sinnvoll, dann auch internieren wollten. Das haben sie auch getan.
When we take into account the process of denazification and the consequences for the partners and financiers of Adolf Hitler, we find a number of curious cases of leniency. Max Serio, for example, the man who ran the publishing empire that made Hitler one of the wealthiest men in the world, would be sentenced to 10 years of forced labor. He would be released after just 5. Hitler's personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, whose photos earned the Führer millions in royalties, and who would make a fortune for himself by trading looted art, would be sentenced to only 4 years in prison.
Outrageous when you think about it. And the number of sort of people who met justice wasn't great. And they said the denazification program was, they called it a personal certificate. Because what you did was you got 3 people to say, yes, you were a Nazi, but you had 3 or 4 people who thought you were okay, and they signed it at the bottom. They called it the Persil certificate because Persil was a soap powder that said it washed whiter than white. So with this, you could sort of whitewash your past in that way.
Hoffmann became a poster boy for the cynicism and inefficiency with which denazification was carried out by the post-war German authorities. Shortly before he passed away peacefully at the age of 72, he would recover a considerable part of his stolen art collection. Something similar would occur with many industrialists and businessmen who supported and financed the Nazi regime.
Jedoch für die Unternehmen selber hat das zunächst keine Bedeutung. Hier gibt es ab 1947 schon die Entscheidung, die deutsche Industrie längerfristig wieder aufzubauen. Und obwohl einige Führungspersönlichkeiten ausgetauscht wurden, blieb das Management in der zweiten Reihe in der Regel von der Nazifizierung völlig unbeeinträchtigt, weil sie dann in die Positionen nachrücken konnten, die vorher durch Entnazifizierung freigemacht wurden.
On September 11, 1949, U.S. President Harry S. Truman appointed John J. McCloy as the new American High Commissioner for Occupied Germany. McCloy would proceed with a program of mass amnesty for several former Nazi war criminals whose sentences were either commuted or canceled, including almost all of the industrialists tried at Nuremberg.
Sie wurden begnadigt, weil die Vereinigten Staaten und die anderen Westalliierten ihre Beziehungen zur Bundesrepublik Deutschland normalisierten und dann praktisch dann als Preis für, kann man sagen, diese Normalisierung und für die beginnende Wiederaufrüstung der Bundesrepublik und für die Wiedereingliederung der Bundesrepublik in das westliche Vertragssystem bereit waren, auch ehemalige Nationalsozialisten in alliierter Haft freizulassen.
The most prolific and loyal of all the Hitlerite industrialists, Friedrich Flick, was a free man by 1950. He would not only recover all his former enterprises located in West Germany, but would also invest in several developing companies and become the largest shareholder at Daimler-Benz. He ended up as probably the richest man in West Germany, leaving an empire of 330 companies with a turnover of 8 billion Deutschmarks after his death in 1972. Alfred Krupp would be pardoned in 1951 and also recovered part of his forfeited industries. He regained his personal fortune, reinstating his family's industrial empire, and even established a foundation named after him, which included on its supervisory board banker Hermann Josef Abs. As one of the chairmen of the Deutsche Bank during the war, Abs was responsible for the Aryanization of formerly Jewish-owned businesses. He would never be prosecuted for his crimes, and even retained his chairmanship of some of these companies after the war. But the greatest scandal was that some of those convicted in the IG Farben trial would also receive pardons from McCloy's High Commission. In 1950, both Karl Krauk, the chairman of the supervisory board of IG Farben, and Fritz Termeer, one of the brains behind the creation of the industrial complex at Auschwitz, had their sentences substantially reduced. The following year, it was the turn of Auschwitz plant managers Otto Ambros and Walter Dürfeld to be pardoned and immediately released from their 8-year prison sentences. Like Flick and Krupp, nearly all IG Farben war criminals would return into the post-war German business world and hold important positions in several corporations and banking institutions.
And I think it is one of the terrible aspects of the post-war period. And because we were so keen to revive West Germany economically, we turned a blind eye to a lot of these people who ran these businesses, who were very much implicated with Hitler's regime. They were implicated, as we know, with forced labor as well.
German-based American subsidiaries Opel GM and Fordwerk were also among those that used slave labor during the war. Despite their claims of not having control of their German subsidiaries, both American corporations would do their utmost to try to get their hands on profits earned in Germany during that period.
So Ford and General Motors both have a huge problem on their hands at the end of the Second World War. They have these profits that have piled up in Opel and in the Ford Werke plant in Germany. The other problem they face is that the German mark has now a disproportionately poor exchange rate against the US dollar. And so how can they possibly take these profits back to the US politically or even economically? This question drags on for years. In the 1950s, both Ford and General Motors do try to repatriate their profits and do so successfully in some cases, but they take a huge cut rate.
As well as banking the wartime profits, both companies would also claim compensation for war damage sustained at their slave labor-staffed factories in Germany.
In the ultimate act of cynicism, however, both Ford and General Motors asked the US government to compensate them for the wartime damage to their factories in the Third Reich. This is a move that is almost unbelievable. These are companies asking for compensation that the Allies have inflicted on their companies in the Third Reich. And General Motors is actually successful. The US government pays them more than $30 million in compensation for damage to the Opel factory, effectively. Ford asked for the same thing, but the US government in the 1960s, 20 years after the end of the war, is much less generous, only gives Ford a little bit over $1 million in compensation.
Although the Allies let German industrialists and financiers off the hook, they were rather more efficient at tracing the vast wealth and national assets stolen by the Nazis. At the end of the war, the Western powers' secret intelligence services launched a scheme aimed at seizing stolen Nazi loot from neutral countries called Operation Safe Haven.
Operation Safe Haven was an undercover operation sort of spearheaded by the United States Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor to the CIA. And it was to crack down on all of this money laundering around the world that the Nazis were doing.
Through Operation Safe Haven, the Allies would recover a significant part of the assets stolen by the Reich and would further develop a program of restitution controlled by the Tripartite Gold Commission.
The Tripartite Gold Commission was set up to redistribute, to give back the gold that the Nazis had stolen. But once countries went into the Soviet sphere, they were somewhat punished because the gold didn't go back to them. So in some cases, you had the tripartite gold going back to some of these countries in the 1990s because of the geopolitics involved.
There was a campaign early on to take 10% of the industrial capacity of Germany and send it to the Soviet Union as reparations. That was how reparations were conceived, as a matter not to deliver money to individuals, but to deliver money between states.
Besides gold, the next most commonly looted commodity in Nazi-occupied Europe was art. The Allied armies set up special staffs during the war, which had the task of securing separate cultural assets from the occupied states of Europe, registering and then re-registering them with the help of the deprived museums and individuals.
Sie waren damit auch also zunächst relativ erfolgreich, jedoch gab es einen nicht geringen Teil der Kunst, vor allen Dingen der Gemälde, die nicht mehr auffindbar waren und die immer noch als verloren gelten. Es gab Fälle, in denen haben sich amerikanische Soldaten dann teilweise auch einige Kunstwerke dann unter den Nagel gerissen. Gab aber dann auch Fälle, in denen in den letzten Kriegstagen beispielsweise solche Kunstdepots auf deutscher Seite geplündert wurden.
Now, of course, because it was hidden by Nazis and then maybe recovered later, we don't know how much disappeared. But what we do know is that there are a lot of works of art, in museums, in galleries all over Europe that just have an empty space where a work of art, used to hang. So, there are still people today, I'm convinced, who will buy and sell art stolen by the Nazis in secret. Make no mistake, this is a criminal activity, but I have no doubt that there are some very bad people around, who still trade Nazi stolen goods.
But it would be the individual victims of Nazism who would encounter the greatest obstacles in recovering their rightful assets and possessions in the post-war period. Many historians and researchers have tried to estimate the value of the stolen goods, property, and possessions during the Nazis' 12-year reign of terror. While some of it has been recovered, there is still a lot that is missing, leading to several conspiracy theories, treasure hunting, and the ongoing search for the lost Nazi gold.
Typically, we hear about stories of gold found underneath a lake called Lake Toplitz, and there's never really been any gold found there. Then there was talk about a train full of gold underneath a Polish mountain. Again, that's never really ever been shown to be true. I think there's a lot of nonsense written about Nazi gold, and people talk, it's something for a thriller or a movie. But I suspect, yes, there must be some gold that was, hidden, and I suspect that if that's going to be anywhere, it's underneath the streets of Zurich or Geneva. It's going to be in a Swiss bank.
There is little doubt that neutral Switzerland played a massive role in looting of art and personal wealth during the Second World War. The secrecy of the Swiss banking system allowed the Nazi regime to launder much of the gold and currency pillaged from their victims. On March 8, 1945, the Allies and the Swiss had reached an agreement to cut off trade and freeze German assets in the country, promising to return any identifiable gold to its rightful owners. But there was a problem in identifying whom the rightful owners were, since the Nazis had done everything possible to cover their tracks and prevent its identification.
It's another way that the Nazis had sort of protected themselves. I mean, they re-smelted all of the gold and they put German markings on the gold, so nobody really knew whose gold was whose gold. At the end of the war, when their heirs went to try to reclaim those assets and the banks asked them for a death certificate proving that the beneficial owners had died, you know, the answer often was, well, Auschwitz and Dachau didn't give us death certificates, so there was no way to prove a death. And the Swiss bankers will just said, well, I'm sorry then, you know, there's nothing we can do for you.
Claimants and relatives of the millions who had perished in the Nazi death camps had a hard time trying to put pressure on Swiss banks to release information about their wartime holdings, especially since the Swiss used the onset of Cold War hostilities to put the brakes on much of the restitution process.
So we've got all these properties that actually belong to other people, and yet they were never repatriated back. Again, why? Part of this Cold War psychosis. Oh, we can't bring up this issue at this time. So there you have Jewish property, Jewish money, all taken away in that period. I mean, it's a scandal, and it's a scandal that wasn't actually redressed. It wasn't redressed in the post-war period.
Only after the Berlin Wall came down in 1989 would millions of documents related to World War II be declassified in both the East and the West, bringing new light to the involvement of banking institutions and worldwide corporations on the Hitler money trail.
It was only later in the Clinton era that there was a push for reparations payments from individual industries to individual former victims who had been living as survivors for the last about 20, 30 years, right? More by the time the 90s rolled around. That kind of marked a new phase.
These documents show that the Swiss claim of neutrality in World War II was pure nonsense. The documents also show that these shipments were carried out by trucks that had the insignias of Switzerland stamped on them. In other words, they actually used Swiss transport. That the gold bars were identified clearly as coming from Germany.
These U.S. congressional hearings served as the basis for several lawsuits brought by victims of Nazism who were still seeking justice and restitution. Organizations like the World Jewish Congress and the World Jewish Agency would take up their cause.
There is no reason in the world why $1, 1 shekel, 1 sterling, 1 franc will be there in the safes and the accounts of banks in a time that it does not belong to them. Every single coin which belongs to the Jews should go back to the individual Jews and to the Jewish people.
Pressed by Jewish organizations in the United States and Israel, the Swiss authorities would at last announce a commission to research and reveal their banking activities during the Nazi period.
We want now to get the truth and we want to deal with it, and if we have to lift the bank secrecy for these cases for 5 years, we'll do it.
They not only put out copious lists of all of the heirless assets they had in their banks, and they invited people from around the world to apply. But in addition to that, they set up a fund that was like over $1 billion in order to help victims of the Nazis.
Other countries all over the world would follow suit and set up their own commissions to research their involvement with Hitler and his regime, leading to the opening of a new question. What about the slave and forced workers that were exploited by the Nazi regime and its partners? What compensation would they receive? In 1999, German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder announced the creation of a new compensation fund for victims of slave labor. Among the signatory companies were Krupp and IG Farben's successors BASF, Hext, and Bayer.
Only a very small amount of compensation was paid in the initial years after the war, right up to the 1990s. A few Jewish slave laborers did get some compensation, and countries like France and Belgium did pay some compensation to their own people who had been deported to Germany. But because of the Iron Curtain, where most of the Eastern forced laborers were sort of cut off from Western Europe, it's only in the 1990s that this really became an issue as Holocaust restitution resurfaced again. And then it was decided, again, partly because of pressure, that the German government and German companies did pay a one-off compensation payment to all Eastern forced enslaved laborers.
The American companies whose German subsidiaries benefited from the use of slave labor would also be forced to face some of their victims and make reparations.
So Ford and General Motors in the 1990s begin facing lawsuits from the slave laborers that have largely helped accumulate those profits during the Third Reich. There's actually lawsuits filed in the United States on a class action basis against those companies, and American courts say they simply don't have jurisdiction over what took place during the Third Reich. But as a result of that legal reckoning, or the opening up of that legal case, both Ford and General Motors put together compensation funds to try to help the victims of slave labor in that sense. I think there's still an open question to some extent as to whether those efforts have been sufficient, but certainly there's a recognition that something needs to be done.
Today, many archives are still waiting to be declassified. Lost treasures and works of art are still being discovered, and thousands of bank accounts, either owned by victims of Hitler's criminal regime or by the Nazis themselves, remain unclaimed.
We are still very much dealing with the legacy of the Third Reich and the Second World War. The victims of Nazism have not nearly received the justice that they can. It is critically important that historians, journalists, and other researchers continue to track down the paper trails to find out where this money went, what profits might still be accumulating in bank accounts based upon the events of the Third Reich, and how justice can continue to be done even in the 21st century.
I think it's best to call it an attempt at justice. It wasn't complete, it was not satisfactory, but the fact that they made the attempt set important precedents, and I think this is what we will really remember about it, that it's not acceptable that these kind of crimes are committed without some effort at compensation and restitution and justice.
He was a lousy student, a failed artist, homeless for many years, an embittered army corporal who, through a tragic quirk of fate, was able to lie, cheat, and barter his way to power before unleashing murder and misery on millions. But he didn't do it alone. Behind him, there were many who financed his rise to power and willingly profited from the business of war, the plundering of a whole continent, the forced labor, and the deaths of millions of innocents. Adolf Hitler took the coward's way out, but many of those who helped him in the largest robbery in history have never been held to account.
I think it's impossible to give an estimation of how much the Nazis stole. I mean, what are you including in that figure? Are you including the gold that they stole from occupied countries, all of the assets that they stole from Swiss banks, the properties that they stole, the businesses that they stole, the art that they looted? The list goes on and on and on. It was a terrible theft that people are still trying to figure out.
Does it make people feel better or worse that it wasn't even that profitable and they did it anyway? If you can understand that, you can understand the Third Reich. If you think it was only about profit, you will never understand the Third Reich.